All right, so can everybody just pull it up on the computer, and then I'll just do it that way. All right. Okay. All right, so with, I'll point out some things as we go through each of the slides. So slide 2, okay, for chapter 3. The last bullet is important to note. Say that no model or theory will get it right all the time. And in practice, often a single theory or approach explains only a small amount of the variance in targeted behaviors. So how do you think that applies to stuttering or fluency?
It's a case-by-case type of situation.
Right, meaning?
If us learning that technique or theory work with one patient doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work with the next patient.
Right. Okay, so we made a list on the board here of some factors we think influences the cause of stuttering, but as we talked about last week, that there are some percentages, right, that fall into one of these brackets, but maybe not everyone. The one thing that we'll talk about as we go through the chapter more so is that the more solid evidence that we have today is more of these here, neurological differences, okay, that have recently come to light with some more imaging studies, okay, and some more research that can be done now to look at the actual cortical differences between people who stutter and then people who don't. Okay, so, but some of these other factors that we talked about, like the environment, like genetics, yet, and you know how kids respond to stress. Also, the other thing I remember too, we talked about last week, was personality a little bit. Okay, so I'll add that to the board here, up here. Do you remember what kind of personality was more prone to developing stuttering?
Is that like highly temperamental?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And reactive was the word, kind of like emotionally reactive to things, more temperamental. And emotionally reactive. Okay, good. Okay, so some of these things we'll talk about tonight are, like I explained before, like old wives' tales. But it's important for us to know the history, okay, of what people really thought about stuttering, to then help shape what we know now. And there still might be people walking around with those ideas still of back in the 1950s, you know, or 40s even. When you watch the King's speech, okay, so that takes place, okay, back in that generation. And the King's therapist was way advanced for his time. But you'll see some of the old wives' tales and these crazy things that they thought would cure stuttering or stop it, you know, in the movie. If you, you know, haven't seen it already, then you'll obviously see it, you know, in the movie. So, also, they mentioned too that the person who stutters themselves, if it's obviously an adult, you know, they may have been influenced by some of those older theories that really aren't true. Okay, so it's your client, even themselves may have some of those ideas or false notions about what's causing them to stutter. Okay, um, so like I said, we can talk about some of, I like to call them influences in maybe what causes stuttering, but as Jose said, everybody's a little bit different, right? And then everyone brings something different to the table. We all have, different genes, different, even though we're all human beings, our bodies operate a little bit differently, obviously. And so it's important to also be aware of stereotypes, okay, about stuttering. Okay? I think, our society is more open to talking about things today, okay? More open to learning about things today. I don't know about accepting. I mean, I think we can, we're more vocal and verbal about, but, people still have their stereotypes, right? And still have their ideas and, so the person who stutters kind of also has that too, so they may also think that, well, I can't talk perfectly, so I can't do X, Y, and Z. Okay, so you may also be working with a parent who thinks that way, of a child, of one of your clients. And, sometimes stereotypes and attitudes and emotions are hard to break, So I had, the luxury of working with OP, my client here, my school age child who stuttered, and his parents were very supportive of him, and though I mentioned I'm always not so sure how critical they were of him, of his speech, as far as judging, and not in an outward way, but by facial expressions or by attitudes or emotions, those kinds of things, especially from mom's end. So most of my communication over the years when OP was coming was through dad. Okay, so when like one parent kind of drops off and it's the mom, like it's usually the end, where dad maybe isn't as involved, but the mom is more the one that you end up communicating with. But it was interesting to see that the last couple years OP was coming, that I only had communication with dad. Dad was the one to fill out the initial intake forms. He was the one to indicate that his goal for OP was to just improve his ability to communicate and feel good about talking. So fantastic attitude, you're right away. So I was very lucky that I had that kind of attitude, with the parent, my client that I was working with. So, but I did have the experience of working with a client who was in second grade and third grade, 2 years, where the parent did not share that attitude, okay, and wanted the stuttering fixed. Okay, so in the schools, you're a little more challenged with how much you can communicate with parents, just because of your schedule and just when parents are available to speak with you. So I did end up having discussions and meetings with the parent, to try and explain the nature of stuttering, the nature that this, again, may be chronic and it's neurological, and, that, the outcomes is not necessarily going to be getting rid of stuttering, and explaining the different therapy approaches. And so, in that particular case, the parent was open to what I was saying, but I came with a lot of evidence and research to back me up, which is always very helpful when you're talking to parents. It's not just coming from you. This is what all the gurus and the research is saying, okay? So But all in all, I did hear years later when I was no longer working with this student that the parents' attitude really hadn't changed much over the years. Okay, so so just keep that in mind. You know that here at the clinic we're a private setting. We have the luxury of having more interaction and communication with families. You know, they often bring their children here to the clinic. And or you know we have set up where we can have more open communication and maybe you can in the schools. So that was just one thing that was a little bit more challenging for me. But okay, with moving into some of the categories of theories. Okay. The textbook breaks up the theories into 4 different areas. One physiological, the other psychological, the other learning, and the last one multifactorial. So we're going to go through these different categories and kind of talk about what has more weight and what kind of doesn't anymore. So they start out talking about emotional and psychological views. So mentioned, you know, back in the 40s, Freud was really big, okay, and everything was caused by your psychological state, right? And so, you know, stuttering was a symptom of internal conflict, right? It's according to Freud, right? And in the 90s, they did some good research to say, no, that's crazy, okay? Literally. No. So, you know, in conclusion, definitely by 2005, they're saying here that people who stutter are no more neurotic, you know, than people who have, you know, general population, okay? And they're not any more at risk of having psychological disorders than anybody else walking around, okay? So we do not think your child began stuttering because of any serious emotional difficulties, okay? So I think it's a fine line. So just to point out back over here, okay, that something that's maybe stressful in the environment or not, home life is not ideal, but it is what it is, you know, that's not causing a child to have psychological problems. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, and that because a child starts stuttering does not mean they're suffering psychologically, okay, by maybe what's going on as far as maybe chaos in the home or something. Yes, it's not ideal, okay, and it may be causing the child some stress, okay, but I don't want you to think, you know, when we talk about negative emotions associated with stuttering or anxiety, you know, or those kinds of other words that relate to emotions and people's kind of, you know, psychological status, doesn't mean that we're labeling either child and or adult who stutters as having some type of psychological problem or disorder. Does that make sense? Some people, you know, other classes have brought up, well, when do I refer my client if I think they are too anxious? So we'll talk about counseling further on in the semester, but unless your client is anxious, okay, about things that are abnormal outside of talking or stuttering, okay, yeah, maybe there is an issue, okay. But if their anxiety and negative feelings and other issues that they have are related to stuttering and talking, okay, then would we refer to a counselor for that? Why not?
Would you provide like the treatment to overcome those situations?
Yeah, we're the ones to provide then the support and counseling. So when we get to counseling, we'll talk about some techniques and things, you know, that we use in therapy to address those negative feelings. But referring a client to some other counselor who has no idea about stuttering or is not a speech language pathologist and has no idea about the disorder would not be helpful, okay, to a client, right, to counsel them on their communication disorder. So slide 7 kind of goes into that, talking about anxiety being typical and natural, okay, about treatment, about stuttering, about talking, you know, about maybe socializing because they stutter, like anything related, you know, to that big umbrella of anything filtering over, affecting that client as it relates to them having a stuttering disorder, okay? So again, labeling a client with PD, meaning psychological disorder, and that's what that means in the slides, unnecessarily pathologizes person who stutters, so that's PWS, with additional stigma and shame. Okay, so yeah, so we don't want to add fuel to the fire, okay, with obviously the difficult situation they're dealing with, okay. And research has shown that experienced clinicians do not report high levels of personality disorders with clients, okay. All right, so there's some anecdotes from clinicians who have worked with many people who stutter, and one clinician says it's very rare that anybody would exhibit any type of anxiety, you know, or personality disorder, psychological disorder, and so again, the theme can be anxiety. Okay, but again, it has to be related to stuttering. Okay, and again, they summarize that it's a normal reaction, okay, and not part of a psychological disorder. All right, so earlier on, and I guess again, they're showing you kind of where this stems from. Anxiety disorder, NOS, not otherwise specified. They're stating here clinically significant social phobic symptoms that are related to the social impact of having a general condition. So they do describe some other conditions, and stuttering was included. So that was the DSM-4. Okay, so further on, okay, they've updated now in slide 12. You see the DSM-5, okay, back in 2013. They've updated that in order to diagnose someone with an anxiety disorder, okay, the disturbance can't be accounted for another problem like autism spectrum disorder, obesity, expressive language problems, child onset fluency. Okay, so again, some of the, you know, years ago, people may have labeled someone as having an anxiety problem, person who stutters, okay, but now we know that that's not true, okay, and they've updated the DSM-5 now to indicate that you cannot label someone as having anxiety disorder if they demonstrate some other type of problem that would obviously naturally contribute to some anxiety. Okay. So, like I said, it can be a sign if fear, anxiety, or avoidance is unrelated or out of proportion to the problem. So, like I said, if someone is anxious about things that are not typical or normal, and not outside of stuttering, then I'm not saying that person, that it's never possible that person could have a co-occurring anxiety disorder, okay? But you just have to be careful, okay, about labeling someone who stutters and is dealing with typical emotions, about stuttering as having some type of psychological problem. And that's really what it's saying. Okay. What else I want to tell you? Yeah, they say some of these theories, it's because, I guess, individuals in books and movies have been portrayed as having personality dysfunction. Okay. And because naturally people who stuttered, they had some social distance and rejection from others, reduced educational, vocational opportunities, shame and low self-esteem, then, it was more considered something's wrong with you, and that, you have psychological problems. So, so what, again, the big conclusion of this too is that research is now looking at, and this is where, again, they were looking at the personalities of kids, okay, and kind of their baseline levels of emotions and how they handle stressful situations and handle some adversity a little bit, and kind of looking here, it says research appears to focus on how emotional processes either facilitate or diminish, okay, healthy functioning among people who stutter. Okay, so kind of looking at, okay, if a person tends to be more anxious about their stuttering and more self-critical, does that kind of, again, fuel the fire, okay, for more severity, okay, in their stuttering. Okay, so that's more so what they're looking at.